First Migrants, Ancient Migration in Global Perspective by Peter Bellwood. This is a summary of the book. Chapter 1: The Relevance and Reality of Ancient Migration as a Defining Human Trait. The ability and tendency to migrate over large distances is presented as a defining characteristic of Homo sapiens. Simple definition of migration. For prehistoric contexts, migration is defined as the permanent movement of a population to a new territory. The distinction between colonization, movement into uninhabited areas, and immigration, movement into already inhabited areas, is also noted. Challenges in studying prehistoric migration. It is difficult to identify the specifics of prehistoric migrations, such as precise timings, numbers of people involved, and languages spoken. The archaeological, linguistic, and genetic records offer evidence, but they are often incomplete. Importance of multidisciplinary evidence. The chapter stresses that no single technique can reveal the full picture of prehistoric human migrations. Instead, a combination of data from archaeology, comparative linguistics, and human biology is necessary. Migration as a driver of change. Migration is shown to impose new patterns in culture, language, and biology, leading to new variations on which evolution can act. It is not a cause of innovation or mutation, but a mechanism of spread that allows such changes to find new ground. Major phases of migration. The book focuses on three major phases of migration: migrations of extinct Homo species within and out of Africa, migrations of ancestral modern humans, H. sapiens, across the globe, migrations of farmers, herders, and boat builders during the past 10,000 years. Migration and demographic expansion. The book argues that demographic growth can drive migration and that advancements in technology and subsistence practices enable population growth and migration. Migration in history and ethnography. Historical and ethnographic records provide comparative data on migrations and how these migrations happened. The Helvetii migration into Gaul, the Chinese migration out of central China between 250 BC and 400 AD, and the newer expansion in East Africa during the 19th century, are cited as examples. The chapter emphasizes that ethnographic examples, such as the Newer and Iban expansions, can provide insights into the motives for migration in kinship-based societies, with land and resources as primary drivers. Motives for migration. Motivations for migration include the need for new land and resources and the rise of the social status for the migrants. Chapter 2: Making inferences about prehistoric migration changes in time and space. The chapter explores how changes in genes, languages, and cultures can be used to understand migration. It addresses the question of whether the spread of an archaeological culture equates to the spread of a language, or if the spread of a language equates to the spread of a breeding population, and so on. The imperfect correlation of genes, languages, and cultures. It's important to recognize that genes, languages, and material cultures don't always move in perfect unison. Biological inheritance follows a pattern of vertical descent, with individuals inheriting genes from parents. Language and culture, on the other hand, can spread horizontally through learning, cultural exchange, and admixture. This is why people can speak related languages but look different biologically. Human biology, genetics, and migration. Genetic data, especially from mtDNA and NRY systems, can be used to trace migration patterns, with molecular clocks used to estimate the timing of population splits. However, these clocks are associated with large degrees of error, and disagreements exist over which clock, based on which part of the genome, is most reliable. It's important to note that a mutation's age does not necessarily equate to the timing of a population's migration. For example, British people who migrated to Australia and the United States carried mtDNA lineages that had mutated in Paleolithic Europe. The chapter suggests that ancient DNA from remains provides a more direct means of tracking migrations than phylogeographic methods based only on living populations. Demic diffusion. The spread of genetic characteristics through intermarriage between adjacent populations, known as gene flow, does not always involve long-distance migration. Mating generally occurred locally in traditional societies, and gene flow is not as random as in modern global situations. Significant migration of people is required to spread genes over large distances. Language families and migration. The spread of language families requires significant migration of native speaker communities, not just language shift. Linguistic evidence is most reliable for the past 12,000 years. It's difficult to make conclusions about the Paleolithic using linguistic data. The transition from hunting and gathering to food production was a major turning point for language spread and replacement, with agricultural transitions marking a significant shift. Language movement by human migration was more likely in small-scale prehistoric societies. Cultures in archaeology and migration. Archaeological cultures can be used to infer migration. The movement of material culture may indicate population migration, but cultural changes can also occur without significant migration. Archaeological evidence alone is prone to ambiguity, so a multidisciplinary approach is crucial. Examples of intensive culture change without significant migration include Roman Britain, where the local population did not widely adopt a Romance language, and Indic Southeast Asia. In contrast, the Anglo-Saxon migration to England provides an example of intensive cultural change with significant migration. The importance of separation. For differentiation to occur in biology or culture, there must be separation between ancestral forms that once shared a common origin. This separation requires expansion or migration. Without it, any diversity would be swamped. Chapter 3: Migrating Hominins and the Rise of Our Own Species. Hominin Evolution and Taxonomy. The chapter defines the Hominidae family, which includes great apes and humans, and the Hominini tribe, which includes all bipedal human ancestors, known as hominins. The genus Homo is believed to have emerged in Africa around 2.5 million years ago from an ancestor within the genus Australopithecus. Other extinct hominin genera, like Kenyanthropus, Ardipithecus, Australopithecus, and Paranthropus, are also noted as being African. The chapter emphasizes that fossil hominin species classification is complex due to variations in chronology, small sample sizes, and fragmentary preservation. Some species, though classified separately, interbred to a small degree. The idea of extinction by assimilation is introduced, where a dominant species gradually incorporates the genes of a less dominant one. Early hominin characteristics and behavior. Early Homo species developed a bipedal posture, which allowed them to stride, run, and travel long distances. They also developed a precision grip, enabling tool use, and an omnivore dentition, suitable for both plant and meat consumption. It is unclear whether early Homo had the same social structures as modern human hunter-gatherers, but it is suggested that cooperative groups with rudimentary language would have been more successful in colonizing new lands. The use of fire, though debated, could have aided in digestion, brain development, and strengthening family bonds. The first hominin migrations out of Africa. Out of Africa 1. The chapter describes how early hominins migrated out of Africa into Eurasia, with evidence of H. erectus fossils found in Manasai, Georgia, dating back to about 1.8 million years ago. Other early sites include locations in China and Java, with some evidence of hominin presence as far as China and Indonesia shortly after 2 million years ago. These early migrations were likely influenced by climatic changes during the Pleistocene epoch, which created habitable corridors through the Sahara and Arabian deserts during warmer, wetter periods. The reasons for migration may have included curiosity, dietary changes, and genetic mutations. Early Homo populations were able to migrate across Asia as far as China and Indonesia despite having relatively small bodies and brains. Hominin expansion and technological development. Acheulean hand axes associated with Homo heidelbergensis are found in many regions of Africa and Eurasia around 800,000 years ago, suggesting a migration from Africa. The chapter notes that early hominins in Eurasia, like those in Africa, preferred open grasslands or forest steppe conditions, with the ability to adapt to cooler climates. The use of fire and the development of fitted clothing and shelter are seen as important factors in the ability to expand into colder latitudes. The origins of Homo sapiens. Out of Africa 3, the chapter discusses how Homo sapiens evolved from H. heidelbergensis in Africa and migrated out of Africa. The fossil and genetic records support the idea of an African origin for H. sapiens, particularly in East Africa and potentially also Southern Africa. Genetic diversity in modern humans decreases with distance from Africa, suggesting a series of bottlenecks as populations migrated. The dating of the Homo sapiens migration out of Africa is under discussion and ranges from 135,000 to 50,000 years ago. Homo sapiens interbred with archaic hominins like Neanderthals and Denisovans. Early H. sapiens societies may have had kinship systems that allowed them to form larger cooperating units compared to other hominins. The evolution of language is seen as a crucial development, but the precise timing of this development is not known. The expansion of Homo sapiens across continents. H. sapiens first expanded into the Levant during the last interglacial period, and then further into southern Asia. The expansion into temperate Eurasia did not occur until around 50,000 years ago, after the development of Upper Paleolithic technology, likely from a source in northern Africa. The chapter argues that H. sapiens populations assimilated rather than exterminated all surviving archaic hominin populations, with some genetic mixing. The chapter suggests that the rapid spread of the aurignation industry between Europe and the Altai occurred within a few millennia, indicating significant mobility. Chapter 4 Beyond Eurasia. The pioneers of unpeopled lands Wallacea and beyond, Australia. The Americas' early human migration to Wallacea, Australia, and New Guinea around 50,000 years ago. Homo sapiens reached Australia and New Guinea, which were connected as a single landmass called Sahul at the time, by crossing the sea from the islands of Wallacea. This migration was a tropical achievement requiring seacraft, and was accomplished by people carrying a Middle Paleolithic technology. Their technology was based on the removal of flakes from pebbles and other stone cores, lacking the blades and backed tools characteristic of the Upper Paleolithic in Eurasia. This technology is more closely related to the Mousterian and Levalloisian core and flake technologies associated with Neanderthals in the Western Old World. The initial modern humans in Southeast Asia are considered the ancestors of the indigenous populations of the Western Pacific, including island Melanesia, New Guinea, Australia, and some Negrito populations. These populations are referred to as Australo-Melanesians. Homo floresiensis, or hobbits, did not reach Australia or Timor, suggesting that ocean crossing was not common for archaic hominins until modern humans crossed the Wallace Line. The people who colonized Australia and New Guinea had the ability to use watercraft, grindstones, and edge-ground pebble axes, and they transported raw materials over distances up to 150 kilometers. They hunted in coastal rainforests, subsisted from littoral resources, and even reached a valley 2,000 meters above sea level in New Guinea. While there was no human occupation in the Ivoni Valley in New Guinea during the last glacial maximum, 25,000 to 19,000 years ago, there was evidence of human occupation in caves in southern Tasmania during this time. This may reflect the use of marsupial skin clothing as protection from the cold. The archaeological record shows that humans had penetrated Central Australia before 40,000 years ago. Tasmania was reached by a land bridge that existed around 43,000 years ago. Populations in southwest Tasmania inhabited caves and manufactured skin clothing using steep-edged stone tools. The colonization of the Americas occurred much later than the colonization of Australia, around 16,000 years ago. This migration required crossing a land bridge, Beringia, and navigating through or around ice sheets. The oldest archaeological sites in the Americas, south of Alaska, are associated with bifaces and large blades, not microblades. The presence of sites such as the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, which dates to about 15,000 years ago, and Monte Verde in Chile, which dates to 16,000 years ago, shows the rapid spread of humans throughout the Americas. The people at Monte Verde built wooden shelters, used medicinal plants from long distances, and made wooden fire drills, spears, and small stone lanceolate bifaces. The spread of large blade and biface technology suggests it was the first to arrive, while microblade technology never expanded beyond northern and western North America, indicating that it arrived with slightly later populations. The colonization of the Americas happened during a period of climatic warming after the last glacial maximum. Additional points: the book notes that the extreme degree of endemism of Homo floresiensis suggests that ocean crossing was not a common event for archaic hominins until modern humans developed functional watercraft. The reasons for the seemingly rapid expansion of Homo sapiens into diverse environments include the use of fire, fitted clothing, shelter, and watercraft. The chapter emphasizes that the migrations into Australia and the Americas involved the settlement of previously uninhabited lands. Chapter 5: Hunter-gatherer migrations in a warming post-glacial world. Key themes and concepts: post-glacial recolonization of northern Eurasia. As the ice sheets of the last glacial maximum retreated, humans began to move back into northern Eurasia. During the glacial maximum, 25,000 to 19,500 years ago, populations were concentrated in southern refuges like Iberia and southwestern France. Starting around 19,500 years ago, there was a population expansion from these refuges into continental Europe. By 11,500 years ago, humans had reached northern regions of Finland and Norway. The chapter suggests that the retreat of ice sheets and the warmer climate created new opportunities for expansion. The distribution of human populations during this period can be tracked using C14 dating. These post-glacial movements in Europe were similar to those in the Americas, with a push into new territories as they became habitable. Further migrations across Bering Strait. After the initial colonization of the Americas, additional migrations occurred across the Bering Strait. These later migrations brought the Nodine and Eskimo-Aleut language families to North America. Unlike the earlier Amerindian language families, these later language families have living relatives in Siberia. The chapter details that these migrations included the Thule Inuit migration and the Apashean migration. Nodine and Apashean migrations. The Nodine language family spread into North America from Siberia, with a notable migration of Athapascan speakers from the Yukon Territory to the U.S. Southwest. This latter movement is known as the Apashean migration. The Apashean migration, which led to the settlement of the Navajo and Apache, covered 3,000 kilometers from Canada to the U.S. Southwest. A massive volcanic eruption producing the White River ash around AD 800 might have triggered movement south of the ancestral Apashean population. These migrations are among the longest-distance hunter-gatherer migrations recorded in recent prehistory. The spread of the Nodine language is associated with the Arctic small tool tradition, which may have been the first colonization of the Arctic coastline of North America, though this is still debated. The Athapascan expansion occurred after the initial peopling of the Americas, but before the arrival of Europeans. The Holocene colonization of Arctic coastal North America. The Arctic coastline of North America was not colonized until about 5,000 years ago during a period of maximum mid-Holocene warming. The Paleo-Eskimo colonization occurred at this time, but the population eventually declined as the climate cooled. The Thule Inuit migrated into the same landscape after AD 1200 during the medieval warming. The chapter highlights that technology for clothing, hunting, food storage, and shelter was key to survival in these environments. The Eskimo-Aleut language family developed in coastal Alaska and spread along the Arctic coastline. The Thule migration around AD 1000 included use of polished slate tools, larger boats, similar to the Umiak, dog-drawn sleds, and advanced harpoon heads, showing advanced technology compared to the earlier Paleo-Eskimos. Iron tools used in this period might have been obtained from meteoric sources or through trade with Norse hunters and traders. The successive Eskimo-Aleut migrations were likely facilitated by successive periods of warm mid-Holocene and medieval climate. The early Holocene colonization of a green Sahara. During the early Holocene, the Sahara region experienced a period of increased rainfall, turning it into a grassland. This allowed for the expansion of human populations and the presence of wild animals, such as cattle and wild millets. Humans were present in this Green Sahara by 800 BC hunting wild cattle. Cattle bones have been found at sites in the western desert of Egypt, dating back to approximately 800 BC. Cattle spread westward relatively slowly to reach the Niger River in Mali around 2000 BC, with little evidence for domestication before 5000 BC. This period of a Green Sahara is related to the northward movement of the African summer monsoon. However, as the Sahara became more arid again, some populations adopted cattle pastoralism. Continental shelves and sea level changes. Sea level changes also played a role in human migrations by either exposing or submerging land. The drowning of the Sunderland continental shelf in Southeast Asia due to rising sea levels forced coastal populations to move and adapt. The chapter explains that archaeological sites on continental shelves that were not glaciated are now often under the sea. Holocene Australia and the Pomonyangan migration. In Australia, evidence suggests a major linguistic shift within the past 5,000 years. The Pomonyangan language family expanded across most of the continent. The distribution of backed artifacts correlates closely with the Pomonyangan language family, suggesting a connection between material culture and linguistic expansion. The chapter discusses that this expansion may have originated in the southeastern side of the Gulf of Carpentaria. The introduction of the dingo into Australia around 3,500 years ago is also noted, which may be associated with the arrival of Austronesian-speaking populations with domesticated dogs in Indonesia. It is also suggested that non-Pomonyangan speakers shifted to using bifacial points at the same time that Pomonyangan speakers increased use of backed artifacts. Chapter 6: The First Farmers and Their Offspring. Origins of Food Production. The most important areas for the beginning of food production were located in tropical monsoonal or warm temperate latitudes with strong seasonality in rainfall. This seasonality was necessary for the annual growth cycle of most major domesticated cereals and legumes. The Fertile Crescent in southwestern Asia was the first agricultural homeland with mixed farming by about 7,500 BC, followed by central China around 5000 BC, and later sub-Saharan Africa, New Guinea, Mesoamerica, and northwestern South America. Why food production developed? The development of agriculture was not a rapid event, often taking 2 millennia or more to progress from initial cultivation to full-scale food production, especially with cereals. Domestication involved a long process of selecting plants with desirable traits like non-shattering grains, synchronous ripening, loss of dormancy, and increased grain size. The transition was facilitated by the rapid warming after the Younger Dryas period, though this was not a universal cause as agriculture did not begin everywhere at the same time. Impact on population. Food production allowed humans to live at significantly higher population densities than hunting and gathering. A 10% increase in agricultural dependence could lead to a 50% rise in population size. This growth was associated with settled life and increased birth rates. Sedentism allowed mothers to have children more frequently, since they did not have to carry children long distances, and animal milk and cereal gruel allowed for earlier weaning. This led to the growth of villages and more localized ethnicities. Intensification versus migration. When populations grew rapidly, there were two main responses: intensification of food production or migration. Intensification involved techniques like irrigation and terracing, whereas migration was more likely when people were in hinterland environments. Early food producer migrations often emanated from stressed hinterland environments rather than core environments of plenty, and might be the result of domino effects originating within the core regions. The role of migration. Food producers were the primary instigators of demographic growth and population expansion, and contributed their genes, culture, and language to migrating populations. Some adjacent hunter-gatherer populations eventually adopted food production as a result of these expansions. The expansion of food producers often led to a decrease in hunter-gatherer survival. Early farming populations close to frontiers of expansion were generally healthy and had high birth rates. Archaeological and linguistic evidence. The expansions of food-producing populations can be traced through archaeology and linguistics. Early farmers created homogeneous cultural landscapes and widespread cultures, indicative of population movement. Many agriculturalist language families spread from homelands located in or near the regions of agricultural origins. Key regions of food production. The Fertile Crescent was the first area to develop agriculture. With mixed farming by 7500 BC, this led to the spread of agriculture into Europe, Central Asia, northern India, and North Africa. The Yellow and Yangtze basins of China saw the origins of rice, millet, soybean, pigs, and chickens. This system spread throughout Asia, with human migration between 4000 and 1000 BC. The Western Pacific, including New Guinea, saw the origins of sugarcane, yams, taro, and bananas after 4000 BC, influencing the Pacific Islands. Major migrations into Oceania occurred after the introduction of Chinese crops such as rice, pigs, and dogs. The eastern woodlands of the United States saw the domestication of native seed-bearing plants after about 4,000 years ago. However, significant population spread did not occur until the adoption of maize during the first millennium AD. Markers of food production. While pottery and polished stone tools are often associated with the Neolithic period, their use was not exclusive to food-producing populations. Pottery is generally more closely associated with food-producing populations, as are polished stone axes, even though some edge-ground axes date to almost 40,000 years ago. Crops and animals. Domesticated crops differ from their wild counterparts in that they do not shatter when ripe, they have looser grains, they ripen synchronously, and they lose their need for dormancy, making them easily transportable to new environments. The species of domesticated animals were generally those that were behaviorally amenable to taming and management. Chapter 7. The Fertile Crescent Food Production Complex. Origins of Agriculture in the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent is the region of origin for domesticated wheats, barley, peas, broad beans, lentils, sheep, goats, pigs, and taurine, non-humped, cattle. Geographically, it curves north of the Syrian desert, from southern Israel to the head of the Persian Gulf, bordered by the mountains of Turkey and western Iran. The climate is warm-temperate with winter rainfall, which is ideal for the cereals and legumes that were domesticated there. The first developments in food production occurred in riverine and lacustrine settings, especially along the Jordan, Upper Euphrates, and Upper Tigris rivers. The wild ancestors of the most important domesticated crops and animals overlapped in distribution in the northern Levant and southeastern Anatolia, though domestication likely occurred in multiple locations. By 7500 BC, the entire Fertile Crescent had developed interconnected production complexes, which fueled significant human migrations. The fusion of cereal and animal species into a domesticated economy occurred gradually during the pre-pottery Neolithic (PPN) phases. The PPNA, 9500–8500 BC, saw pre-domestication cultivation and increasing settlement sizes, while the PPNB, 8500–700 BC, saw domesticated plants and animals become dominant in the food production economies of larger settlements. By 7500 BC, many villages in Western Asia had grown to 10 or more hectares in size, with densely packed rectangular houses, granaries for storing cereals, and a reliance on a fully agro-pastoral economy. Expansion beyond the Fertile Crescent around 700 BC, populations began to spread from the Fertile Crescent, carrying their cultural resources and languages. They moved westward into Europe and eastward into northern India and Central Asia. By 5000 BC, farming populations had reached Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. The expansion was not monolithic. It led to many regional variants as the initial system interacted with existing populations and adapted to new environments. The expansion involved both the movement of people and the adoption of farming by existing Mesolithic populations. The spread of the Fertile Crescent economy was limited by climate. The complex reached its limits in the summer rainfall, monsoon, climates of sub-Saharan Africa and Asia beyond the Indus, because wheat and barley are winter crops and require irrigation when grown during the dry winters in monsoon zones. Expansions into Europe. Neolithic cultures expanded from the Fertile Crescent into Europe by two routes: along the Danube River to the north of the Alps and along the Mediterranean coast to the south. The linear band Kuramic (LBK) culture, originating in the Carpathian Basin, spread across fertile loess soils of northern Europe. The LBK economy was based on permanent field cultivation of emmer and einkorn wheat and common millet, as well as the husbandry of cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats. There is evidence that cattle were milked and that cheese was being made at this time. Expansions into Central Asia and South Asia to the east. The Fertile Crescent agricultural complex spread through a 1,000 kilometers wide belt of steppe grassland, from north of the Black Sea to the Altai and Sion Mountains. By 700 BC, PPN settlers had reached Murghar on the Kochi alluvial plain in Baluchistan, close to the eastern limit of the winter rainfall zone. Murghara's early inhabitants used mud brick constructions similar to those found in the Fertile Crescent, and grew crops like barley, wheat, and dates. The upper and middle Ganges basin was settled by village-dwelling and copper-using agriculturalists of Fertile Crescent origin after 3000 BC, who mixed with local Neolithic rice agriculturalists. The Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley was firmly grounded in a Fertile Crescent food production economy, with the addition of African millets after 2000 BC. Linguistic and genetic evidence. The Fertile Crescent food production complex is associated with the distributions of the Indo-European and Afroasiatic language families. Indo-European languages originated in Anatolia, expanding with the spread of agriculture. The different branches of the Indo-European language family diverged at various points from about 6700 BC to 2600 BC. The Turkic languages of Central Asia are also linked to population expansions from the Fertile Crescent, but their connections are more complex. The Dravidian language family appears to have originated in Iran, with its speakers migrating into southern Pakistan and northwestern India. The Afroasiatic language family is thought to have originated in the Levant. Genetic studies support the idea of population expansion from the Middle East, showing shared ancestry among populations in Europe and northern India. Expansion into North Africa. Neolithic populations from the southern Levant and Arabia moved into North Africa by the 6th millennium BC. Farming villages with Fertile Crescent crops and animals appeared in the Nile Valley around 5000 BC, but the Fertile Crescent cereals and legumes did not initially spread far beyond North Africa. Sheep and goats might have been introduced into Africa separately, before cereals, via the Red Sea from western Arabia, or via Yemen and the Bab al-Mandab to the Horn of Africa. Key points. The Fertile Crescent was the center of origin for many of the world's most important domesticated crops and animals, which were adapted to a winter rainfall regime. The spread of the Fertile Crescent food production complex was a major driver of human migration and cultural change in Western Eurasia. The expansion was characterized by regional variations and interactions between migrating agriculturalists and existing hunter-gatherer populations. The expansion is linked to the spread of major language families, including Indo-European, Afroasiatic, and Dravidian. The Fertile Crescent complex reached its limits in monsoon climates and in regions that were too cold or dry for crop production, even if some aspects, such as pastoralism, were able to extend beyond these limits. The expansions led to the distributions of languages, genes, and economic lifestyles from Gibraltar to Bangladesh, and from North Africa to Scandinavia, which still underpin the Western world today. Chapter 8. The East Asian and Western Pacific Food Production Complexes. Agricultural origins in East Asia. In East Asia, agriculture emerged in the Yellow and Yangtze River basins. By 700 BC, a monsoon climate agricultural complex was developing, with broomcorn and foxtail millet in the Yellow River Valley and short-grained rice in the Yangtze Valley. Pigs were the main domesticated animal in both regions. Pottery was used from the late Paleolithic onward in these regions, because the husked grains of cereals were normally cooked by boiling. Initially, populations used morphologically wild cereals, gradually transitioning to full dependence on domesticated rice and millets between 700 and 4500 BC. The expansion of agriculture led to significant population growth and large villages, with settlements reaching up to 15 hectares by 5000 BC and up to 200 hectares by 2500 BC. The Yellow and Yangtze River basins are considered a combined source of considerable population movement. Although the Yellow and Yangtze valleys had different crops, they formed one internally linked region of development with high artifact similarity. Migrations from the Yellow River Basin broomcorn and foxtail millet cultivation spread north from the Yellow River Basin. Some rice remains have been found at Yellow River Neolithic sites, especially in Shandong Province. Migrations from the Yangtze Basin rice cultivation spread southward from the Yangtze Basin, accompanied by ancestral Tibeto-Burman, Austronesian, Austroasiatic, Thai and Hmong-Mien populations. One migration route went up the southern tributaries of the Middle Yangtze, then down the Pearl River to the coast of Guangdong. Another route went from the lower Yangtze down the Zhejiang coastline to Fujian and Taiwan. By 700 BC, village settlements with wooden pile dwellings and rice husk tempered pottery were established along the middle and lower Yangtze. By 4600 BC, morphologically domesticated japonica rice accounted for about 30% of the plant diet, and by 4000 BC, people were constructing wet fields and settling in large villages. The major spread of population from southern China into Southeast Asia occurred during the 3rd millennium BC, coinciding with very high population growth. The initial domestication of rice, Oryza sativa japonica, occurred in or near the Yangtze Basin from the wild ancestor Oryza rufipogon. Indica rice, Oryza sativa indica, was domesticated from an annual forebear in South Asia, perhaps independently, but the emergence of indica rice as a major crop involved hybridization with japonica. Neolithic cultures such as Tangjiaging, Doshi, Shijia, Himudu, Majayabang, and Liangzhu played significant roles in the southern expansions. The earliest pottery from these sites shows regional similarities from the Malay Peninsula to southern China. Japan offers an example of an independent development of food production, with a range of cereals and tree crops similar to those domesticated in China. The Jomon phase, 14,000 to 500 BC, in Japan was associated with some degree of food production, including soybean, barnyard millet, beans, acorns, chestnuts, walnuts, and some rice. The Jomon culture was Neolithic in terms of pottery, polished stone tools, and large villages, but the level of production was less intensive than in China, and this crop complex did not spread outside Japan. Japan became a recipient of population during the Yayoi phase, which brought wet rice farming, new pottery styles, and bronze and iron working. Island Southeast Asia and Oceania around 3500 BC. The East Asian food production complex spread from southern coastal China into Taiwan, followed by a crossing to the northern Philippines around 2200 BC. After 1500 BC, in the eastern islands of Indonesia, rice and millet cultivation was lost, and tree and tuber crops, such as bananas, coconuts, breadfruit, taro, and yams became more important. The Western Pacific food production complex, which developed independently of East Asia, contributed to the Austronesian migrations into Oceania after 1300 BC. The New Guinea highlands were a core region for the development of crops like bananas, taro, and sugarcane by 4500 BC. The expansion of Austronesian speakers into the Pacific Islands was rapid, facilitated by maritime technology and a mix of horticultural and maritime subsistence. The Lapita culture, which spread through Melanesia, did not rely on rice or cereals, but exploited taro, coconut, candlenut, pandanus, canarium nuts, and bananas. By 900 to 850 BC, Austronesian speakers had reached Tonga and Samoa in western Polynesia, but the colonization of eastern Polynesia took much longer. Austronesians also colonized Madagascar and the Comoro Islands in the Indian Ocean. Linguistic and genetic evidence. The expansion of the East Asian food production complex is associated with the origins of the Sino-Tibetan, Altaic, Austroasiatic, Austronesian, and Thai language families. Austronesian languages first crystallized in Taiwan, with all languages outside Taiwan belonging to the Malayo-Polynesian subgroup. Genetic studies indicate a significant population increase in mainland Southeast Asia around 2500 BC, especially in lineages associated with agricultural populations. The Man Bac Cemetery in northern Vietnam shows that immigrating rice farmers from China interacted with indigenous Australo-Melanesian hunter-gatherers around 2000 BC, but did not immediately blend genetically. Key points. The East Asian food production complex arose independently in the Yellow and Yangtze River basins, with a focus on millets in the north and rice in the south. This complex led to major migrations throughout East and Southeast Asia and into the Pacific. The initial migration was primarily driven by rice cultivation, but in the islands, other crops were adopted. The spread of agriculture was associated with the expansion of major language families, including Austronesian. The Western Pacific food production complex, centered in New Guinea, was unique in its focus on tubers and fruits, and it played a role in the Austronesian colonization of the Pacific. The East Asian complex was constrained by monsoon and trade wind zones, while the Fertile Crescent complex was constrained by winter versus summer rainfall patterns. Chapter 10. The role of migration in the history of humanity. Migration as a distributor of innovation. Migration is presented not as a primary generator of human innovation, but as a mechanism that spreads biological and cultural changes. It allows mutations and cultural innovations to find new environments where they can proliferate, which would not be possible if populations remained static. Human agency. The chapter promotes human agency as the main driver behind prehistoric migrations, rather than climate change or environmental factors. While climate and environmental changes could facilitate migration, it was human decisions, demography, and technological advancements that primarily motivated these movements. The significance of population migration. The book argues strongly against ideas that relate observed biological and cultural patterns purely to factors that do not involve population migration, such as gene flow, cultural diffusion, or language shift, regarding such factors as geographically localized in their direct impacts. Cyclical nature of migration. Migration has occurred continuously throughout human prehistory, but has been cyclical in its intensity, with periods of major movements followed by relative quiescence. Early migrations and extent. The oldest migrations, particularly those of Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, covered the greatest geographical distances, such as the initial settlement of the Americas and Australia. Once the continents were populated, subsequent migrations by hunter-gatherers into inhabited territories became more limited in extent. Holocene migrations. During the Holocene, rapid expansion occurred again with early food-producing populations like the Indo-Europeans, Bantu, and Sino-Tibetans. These groups, with rapid demographic growth and developing technologies, were able to expand into territories previously occupied by hunter-gatherers. However, the extent of these migrations was more limited than the Paleolithic expansions due to geographical barriers for agriculture. Factors influencing migration. Need for land and resources. The most common causal factor for free and considered migrations was the need for land and resources. Demographic pressures. Growing populations required new resources and territories, driving migrations. Technological advancements. Developments in technology, clothing, shelter, and subsistence allowed many episodes of population growth and migration. Small group migrations. Most prehistoric migrations were likely carried out by small groups rather than large, coordinated mass movements. Admixture. Migration into an inhabited territory always involved a process of admixture, not replacement, between migrant and indigenous populations. Comparison of migration phases. Paleolithic migrations. These were the most extensive geographically, involving hunter-gatherers who populated previously uninhabited continents. Holocene migrations. While extensive, food producer migrations were more limited in geographical extent than the Paleolithic migrations. However, they were significant in reshaping population distribution and cultural patterns. Insights into specific migrations. First Americans migrated further than later groups like the Nodine or Eskimo Aleuts because they arrived first in previously unoccupied territory. Austronesians, perhaps the most impressive of the Holocene food producer migrations due to their extensive colonization of the Pacific Islands. Future directions in migration studies. Developments in human genetics, ancient DNA, computational linguistics, chronology, residue analysis and stable isotope analysis in archaeology and bioanthropology are expected to have a tremendous impact on migration studies. Chance will always play a role in the recovery of data, given the destruction and loss of information from the past. Important note: the author stresses the importance of a multidisciplinary approach that recognizes the significance of population migration alongside other factors such as gene flow, cultural diffusion, and language shift. This chapter argues that while other factors can influence human diversity, it was the actual movements of people that shaped the distribution of human populations, languages, and cultures around the world.